Tell it to me again. Wonderful story of love. With the immortal strain. Angels with rapture announce it. Shepherds with wonder receive it. Sinner, oh, won't you believe it? Wonderful story of love. 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 Though you are far away. Wonderful story of love. Still he doth call today. Calling from Calvary's mountain. Down from the crystal bright fountain. E'en from the dawn of creation. Wonderful story of love. 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 Jesus provides a rest. Wonderful story of love. For all the pure and blessed. Rest in those mansions above us. With those who've gone on before us. Singing the rapturous chorus. Wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love.
If you would please open your Bibles to the 26th Psalm, Psalm 26. This, I think, was from our second day's reading this past week. I want to look at this psalm. It is in large part, I think, an encouraging psalm. Gives us some good instructions about how we might live in such a way as to be confident and live in such a way as to be certain that we will be judged in a fair and a hopeful and in a good way by God when we stand before him. This psalm opens, "Vindicate me, O Lord, for I have walked in my integrity. I have trusted in the Lord without wavering. Prove me, O Lord. Try me. Test my heart and my mind." If you just read this and you take it out of its context, you might start thinking that this arises from some type of arrogance on the part of the psalmist. It does not. It arises from faith, an actual confidence in God, a confidence in what God has told him, a confidence in where he stands with God. This is not a faith in himself. It's genuine faith in God and belief that God will do exactly what he has said. The very next verse, as a matter of fact, I think makes this a little bit more clear when it says, "I walk in your faithfulness." So when the psalmist says, "Prove me, try me, test my heart and my mind," the reason he is so confident in saying that is because he is walking in God's faithfulness. He is living the life that God has instructed him to do. It's actually even more clear if you go back to the 25th Psalm. Starting in verse 8 of Psalm 25, the psalmist says this, "Good and upright is the Lord, therefore he instructs sinners in the way. He leads the humble in what is right, he teaches the humble his way. All the paths of the Lord are steadfast love and faithfulness for those who keep his covenant and his testimonies. For your name's sake, O Lord, pardon my guilt, for it is great." Who is the man who fears the Lord? Him will he instruct in the way that he should choose. David knew his great guilt. David didn't think for a moment that he stood on his own, that he could make any claim to righteousness on his own, that he had any power to demand salvation on his own. No, he knew his great guilt, but he also knew God's commandments and that God's commandments arose from his love and that they were designed to lead mankind to our forgiveness. And knowing that the humble who are learning from God what is right, who walk in the paths of the Lord, that they will find themselves in steadfast love and faithfulness from God. That's why he said in our psalm, I walk in your faithfulness. That's what he meant by that. Additionally, David knew that God was faithful to forgive those who walk in his covenant, because he had promised to do so in that very covenant. He further knew that he was striving to faithfully walk in God's covenant. He was trying to do what God instructed to be done, and so he was confident in asking God to examine him. Now, here's the question that we come to, the question that's valid for me and the question that's valid for you. Are we prepared to ask God what David asks God here? Can I say, God, I want you to try me. I want you to test me. I want you to examine me. Listen again to what he said. Prove me, O Lord. Try me and test my heart and my mind. Look at my heart. Look at my attitudes. Look at my beliefs. Look at where I stand. Look at my attitude towards you and towards your creation. Look at my heart and test my mind. Test the things that I think. Test the things that I believe. Test the things that I say. Test the things that I do. Are we in a that we can, with David, ask God to prove us, put us to the test, examine our hearts, examine our minds, and see where we stand? That's bold, but it's not arrogant. And it's built on his confidence and his faith in God. So let's read together this psalm. And then we'll make some observations about it in terms of things that I think we can do and we can apply to our own lives that will help us have the confidence that David had. He says, vindicate me, O Lord, for I have walked in my integrity. I have trusted in the Lord without wavering. Prove me, O Lord, and try me. Test my heart and my mind, for your steadfast love is before my eyes, and I walk in your faithfulness. I do not sit with men of falsehood, nor do I consort with the hypocrites. I hate the assembly of evildoers, and I will not sit with the wicked. I wash my hands in innocence, and I go around your altar, O Lord, proclaiming thanksgiving aloud and telling all your wondrous deeds. O Lord, I love the habitation of your house and the place where your glory dwells. Do not sweep my soul away with sinners, nor my life with bloodthirsty men, in whose hands are evil devices, and whose right hands are full of bribes. Do not sit with men of falsehood, nor do I consort with hypocrites. I hate the assembly of evildoers. I will not sit with the wicked. David is saying that he did not have union with the evildoers. Now, that's not to say that David didn't come across evildoers. That didn't mean that David didn't interact with evildoers. I am certain that there were evildoers in his house, part of his government. I know that there were people from time to time that encouraged him to do things that he didn't believe God would want him to do. From time to time, his very most trusted friends who were standing around to protect him and guard him during the years that Saul was still king, they tried to talk David into killing Saul. And David said, nope, can't do that. God will take him down when it's time. I just have to be patient and wait. They believed they were advising him well, but he didn't believe that they were asking him to do something that God would have him do. And so there were people all around him that may be enticed and caught up in evil. We know that some of his children were. There was all kind of treachery in his own household. There's all kinds of evil around him. That's not what he's talking about. Very much like 1 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 10, when Paul wrote to the church of Corinth and said, if you're not going to have anything to do with any evildoers, you'd have to leave the world altogether. David understood that. What he is saying is that he didn't linger in those environments. He didn't put himself with those people. He didn't sit with them. He didn't consort with them. He didn't plan with them. He didn't participate with them. He had no fellowship with the evil deeds that went on around him. That's what he said. And so when he examined himself and he knew what God had told him to do, he said, you know what, I'm just not going to do those things. It wasn't that he didn't have opportunity to do them. It wasn't that he didn't have temptation to do them. And we know, as we talked about briefly this morning, there was that famous incident where he actually did go headlong into sin. and do all sorts of terrible things when he fell prey to temptation. But he could say at this point that he was avoiding fellowship with evil. And that is something that we need to do. One of the reasons that we might be afraid to face the judgment of God is because we know we haven't avoided fellowship with evil. Look at verses 6, 7, and 8. He says, I wash my hands in innocence and go around your altar, O Lord, proclaiming thanksgiving aloud and telling all your wondrous deeds. O Lord, I love the habitation of your house and the place where your glory dwells. He's talking here about the fact that he had cleansed his hands and engaged in praise and worship of God. That's the contrast to the evil things that he spoke about the verses just before this. He said, I don't sit with these people. I don't practice evil with these people. Instead, I've washed my hands in innocence and I praise and glory and talk aloud about the things that you have done. And I love being where you dwell. I love being with you. I love being in your house. I love worshiping. I love participating with you. If we wash ourselves in the blood of the Lamb, as is talked about in Revelation chapter 7, we become innocent just like David talks about washing his hands and being innocent. If we wash ourselves in the blood of the Lamb and we give ourselves to the worship and praise of God, you remember Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, that talks about what? That our worship, our reasonable service to God is to be transformed in our mind and to do those things which are pleasing to Him and to worship and to honor and glorify Him, that's our reasonable, our spiritual service. That's describing the exact same thing that David's describing here. I go around, I love to be where you are, I love to be in fellowship with you, I love to praise you, I love to tell people what you have done. I like my association with you. I don't want to be associated with evil. I want to be associated with God. If we do this, we're following David as he followed God, because that's what he's talking about. I'm following you, God. Rather than being in evil, I wash my hands in innocence and I follow you. This is, again, akin to something that Paul wrote about in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 1, where he says, be imitators of me as I am of Christ. If we do what David is writing about here, we are following a man after God's own heart in much the same way as what Paul was inspired to tell the Corinthians, follow me as I follow Christ. We have this lesson. If we want to have the confidence, if we want to not fear the coming judgment, then we wash ourselves in the blood of the Lamb and we seek to worship and honor and glory God with our lives. We are not our own. We've been bought with a price. Therefore, glorify God in your body. That's what David's writing about. I use my body to glorify you. Finally, look with me in verse 11. He says, as for me, I shall walk in my integrity. Redeem me and be gracious to me. David was walking honestly, and he was trusting in God to save him. He said, I will walk in my integrity, and he didn't say, I'll walk in my integrity so you owe me something. He said, no, I'll walk in my integrity, and then he asked for God to redeem him. He walked honestly. He walked according to God's commandments. He did all that he knew to do. He strove to be in fellowship with God, and then he trusted in God to save him. Acts chapter 4 and verse 11 says, this Jesus is the stone that was rejected by you, the builders, which has become the cornerstone. There's salvation in no one else. There's no other name under heaven given among men by which we must be saved. We need to understand something. When we walk in our integrity, when we are honest and we are fair and we are just and we do everything that we've been commanded to do, when we go down the line and we can tick off every single box of those things that are righteous, when we get to the end of our life, guess what? We still won't be saved by our integrity. We will not be saved without walking in our integrity. But we will not be saved by walking in our integrity either. We'll be saved by the redemption that is supplied by God through His Son. There is no other name given among men by which we must be saved. Christ is it. Jesus is it. There is no other hope. That is why Jesus taught us that when you've done everything, you should say, I'm an unprofitable servant. I've only done those things which I have, or which are my duty. That is why there are some right here in this assembly who, if you ask them how they're doing, they'll tell you, better than I deserve. Because that's the truth. Because that's the situation. And David understood it. He understood that he had to walk in integrity. He understood that he had to be honest. He had to be fair. He had to be just. He had to serve. He had to help. He had to do all of the things that are good and that are right and that are proper. He had to worship. He had to do all those things. But still, his pleading was with God to redeem him. Because he knew his guilt was great. Hebrews chapter 5, verses 8 and 9. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered, and being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him. Yeah, we have to obey. We have to walk in integrity. We have to do what is right. But he's the source of eternal salvation. He became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him. That just puts us in the class of those who receive the benefits of the work of God. That puts us in the class of those that are the children of God. That puts us in the class of those who receive an inheritance from God. Walking as an upright man, doing what is good and what is just and what is right and what is proper, speaking the truth in love. All of those things simply put us in the class of those who are redeemed by God. Nothing for us to boast in. No pride for us to feel. My foot stands on level ground. That's where he starts off with. He stood on a stable place. His position in life was not shifting. It wasn't moving. He wasn't unsure. He knew what he should do because he was doing what God said that he should do. He was following the righteous commands of God. So he had stable footing. He had a stable ground to walk on. He says, my foot stands on level ground. In the great assembly, I will bless the Lord. He stood on stable ground, and he stood as part of the great assembly. This is not an assembly. This is not the assembly of the church here, or even the assembly of all the Israelites in that day. He's talking about the great assembly. That great assembly of all those that belong to God. That great assembly of all those that are redeemed by him. That great assembly of all those who are God's children. That great assembly that is being discussed throughout the book of Revelations that we're studying on Sunday mornings. That assembly of people. He said, I stand on stable ground and I am among the great assembly of the people of God. The people who God is fighting for, the people who God is serving, the people who God is redeeming, justifying. Our righteousness does not arise from ourselves. Our righteousness arises from God. It's not a righteousness of our own. We're made righteous through him. Like David, this confidence in God that he spoke about, that's where Job found himself as well. I want to go to Job because Job had such a trying and difficult existence on the earth. I don't care how bad you might have things or what kind of terrible thing might have happened to you. If you read the book of Job, you'll understand that Job can relate to you. There's not much terrible in this life that Job did not experience. And listen to what he says. In Job 13, verses 1 through 3, he says, behold, my eyes have seen all of this. And when he says all of this, he's talking about all the things that has happened to him and all the things that he has done and all of his life and all the things that he has witnessed. My eye has seen all of this. My ear has heard and understood it. What you know, I also know. I am not inferior to you. He's responding to his friends. I know everything you know. I've seen everything you've seen. I've heard everything you've heard. I am equal with you. I'm not inferior to you. But I would speak to the Almighty, and I desire to argue my case with God. I would submit to you that Job is not being arrogant. He's being exactly the same as David. When David said, "Prove me, O Lord. Try me and test my heart and my mind." That is exactly what Job is saying. I want to make my case to God himself. I'm not going to bother with you people anymore. I'm not going to talk to you about this anymore. You don't have any more knowledge than I do about this. I need to talk to God. I want to make my case before the Almighty. That's a bold thing to say. It's not arrogant. It's a bold thing to say. He had confidence in the life that he had lived. He knew what God had said. He knew how he had lived. And we're going to find out he knew how God would judge him. Turn over to chapter 23 of the book of Job, when he expands on this. Job answered and said, "Today also my complaint is bitter. My hand is heavy on account of my groaning. Oh, that I knew where I might find him, that I might come even to his seat." Job was on the earth, and Job couldn't get to God so that he could stand before God and stand before the seat of God and have this conversation with God that he thought that he needed to have. He said, "Oh, that I knew where I might find him so I could stand before his seat. I would lay my case before him and fill my mouth with arguments. I would know what he would answer me and understand what he would say to me. Would he contend with me in the greatness of his power?" See, he understood the nature of God, and he understood the greatness of God, and he understood that he didn't hold a candle to God. That's not what he's saying. Listen. Would he contend with me in the greatness of his power? No. He would pay attention to me. See, he did know God. And he knew the love of God, and he knew the concern of God, and he knew that God was interested and that God would listen. He would pay attention to me. There, an upright man could argue with him, and I would be acquitted forever by my judge. Behold, I go forward, but he's not there, and backward, but I do not perceive him. On the left hand, when he is working, I do not behold him. He turns to the right hand, but I do not see him. But he knows the way that I take. And I want you to see what Job's describing there. He says, look, I go forward and I don't find God anywhere. I don't see him. I can't engage with him the way that I would like to. And I go backward and he's not there. And I look to the left and he's right there working to the left and I can't even see it. I don't even see his presence, but he's there. And he turns to the right and I can't see that. I don't see where he's going, but he knows. He knows where I am. He knows the way that I take. When he has tried me, I shall come out as gold. Now that's kind of significant too, because that goes hand in glove with some other things that we've been studying about being tested by fire, again in the Revelation class, about being in the crucible of life and coming through the fire and being purified by it. Job is saying that very thing, that he is going through the fire and he knows that if he stood before God and he was tried and tested by God, that he would come out just like gold. My foot has held fast to his steps. This is why Job is confident. Do you hear the echoes of what David wrote? David said, I walk in your ways. That's the exact same thing Job says. My foot has held fast to his steps. I have kept his way and have not turned aside. I have not departed from the commandment of his lips. I have treasured the words of his mouth more than my portion of food. That's how we get to the place that David got. That's how we get to the place that Job was at. That's how we get to the place that Paul found himself. You remember at the end of his life, when he was facing death and he knew death was coming. He said, look, my life is being poured out. But I know who I believed in. I've entrusted my soul to him against that day. He didn't fear death. He didn't fear his judgment. He knew that it was something very much better for him on the other side of death. That's how you get to that place. When you trust God and you desire his word more than your portion of food. When you are careful to walk in his steps, when you cleanse your hands and engage in the praise and the worship of God while you are alive on this earth and you give your whole heart to him. The question again for you and I is, are we prepared to ask God to try us? Job did. I wish that I could stand before the seat of God today. If I could find it, I'd be there. I would make my argument, and this is what I know. And ask yourself this, do you have this kind of confidence in God? I know that if I stood before God and I made my argument to God, he would listen. Because that's how it is for the upright. That's what Job said. Are we prepared to ask God to try us? Not just put us on trial. That's one way we can look at it, but not just put us on, but to do something that earthly trials can't do. You know what earthly trials do? They try to examine the facts, the physical circumstances, what was done, what can be, not just what was done, but what can be proven to have been done, that you have evidence to establish when and what and how it happened. That's what earthly courts test. Listen to what he says. He doesn't just say, test my behaviors. No, he says to test my heart. To try and examine my mind. Are we ready to ask God to test our hearts and minds? Is your heart where it needs to be? As the deer pants for the water, so my soul longs for you. Does that describe me? If that describes me, then I should not be afraid for God to test my heart, for God to test my mind. I'll be upright. I'll be walking in his ways. He'll love me and there's not one of us that knows the length of our days. Our brother in Christ, Shane Carrington, lost his wife the day before yesterday. She's not much older than me. Life is over. That's the way it works. And there's example after example after example. There's 14-year-olds, there's 20-year-olds, there's 30-year-olds, there's 60-year-olds, there's 90-year-olds. You do not know what tomorrow brings. You do not know what is in store. If Psalm 26 doesn't describe your heart, if it doesn't describe your mind, if it doesn't describe your life, if the ideas that are expressed in the book of Job that we read don't describe where you stand, get there as fast as you can. so that you don't have to fear tomorrow, so that you don't have to hide from God, so that you don't have to be afraid of dying. Someone I know and care very much about, who has lived a long life, has expressed to me more than once, I'm ready to go, but I'm afraid to die. We need to make sure that's not the case. Test my heart and my mind. I need to find myself where I can do that, where I can say to God, test my heart and my mind, and know the ground where I stand. Know that I'm on stable ground. Know that I'm in the great assembly. Know that in the future there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which a righteous judge will award to me on that day. Because he has promised, and I believe. Lesson's yours for your consideration. If we can help you in any way, let it be known as we stand and sing.
Wonderful story of love, tell it to me again. Wonderful story of love, with the immortal string. Angels with rapture announce it, shepherds with wonder receive it. Sinner, oh, won't you believe it? Wonderful story of love, 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 wonderful story of love. Though you are far away, wonderful story of love, still he doth call today, calling from Calvary's mountain, down from the crystal bright fountain, e'en from the dawn of creation. Wonderful story of love, 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 wonderful story of love. Jesus provides a rest, wonderful story of love, for all the pure and blessed. Rest in those mansions above us, with those who've gone on before us, singing the rapturous chorus. Wonderful story of love, wonderful story of love, wonderful story of love, wonderful story of love, wonderful story of